The elevator doors were already sliding shut when I slipped inside, briefcase first, shoulder second, the rest of me following in that practice dance of someone who's done this exact movement 1,000 times before. 43 floors down to street level, then a 12-minute walk to the subway, then 26 minutes on the red line, then 4 blocks to my apartment where I'd heat up whatever was left in my freezer and fall asleep to the sound of my neighbor's television bleeding through paper-thin walls. Routine, predictable, safe. I didn't look up from my phone until I heard the soft rustle of paper bags and caught the scent of something that definitely wasn't the building's sterile air conditioning. Chinese food, maybe. Or Thai. Something with ginger and garlic that made my stomach remind me I'd skipped lunch again. The man standing against the far wall had dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it more than once today, and he was wearing a gray sweater that had seen better days but somehow made him look more approachable, not less. Canvas messenger bags slung across his body, white takeout containers balanced in one arm like he was juggling. He looked comfortable here, which was strange because I knew everyone who worked in this building, at least by sight, and I'd never seen him before. We made brief eye contact. I nodded, he nodded back, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth like he was amused by something I couldn't see. That should have been it. 43 floors of polite silence, then we'd go our separate ways into the city night. And I'd never think about him again. Except we only made it to the 37th floor before everything went wrong. The elevator lurched, not violently, but enough to make my coffee-addled brain register that something was off. My hand instinctively reached for the wall as the car shuddered to a stop with a mechanical groan that sounded like the building itself was sighing in defeat. The lights flickered once, twice, then settled into a dimmer version of their usual fluorescent harshness. Perfect, I muttered, already pulling out my phone to check the time. 6:47 p.m. I had exactly 13 minutes before the last decent train home, and that was assuming I could catch a cab instead of walking. I pressed the emergency call button and waited. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by nothing. Pressed it again. Held it down this time. Hello, we're stuck on... I squinted at the floor indicator, which was flashing an unhelpful sequence of numbers. Somewhere between 37 and 36. Can someone... More static. Then silence. I tried my phone, no signal. Of course. The man with the takeout was still standing against the wall, and when I looked over at him, expecting to see the same frustrated resignation I felt creeping up my spine, he was smiling. Not a nervous smile or a polite waiting room smile. An actual smile, like he found this whole situation mildly entertaining. You're taking this well, I said, not bothering to hide the irritation in my voice. He shrugged, adjusting his grip on the takeout bags. Could be worse, at least I have dumplings. He held up one of the containers like he was making a toast. Want some? I stared at him. We're trapped in a metal box, 37 floors above street level, and you're thinking about food? Well, I was thinking about food before we got trapped, he said reasonably. Getting trapped just means I have more time to think about it. There was something annoying about the way he smiled, like he knew a secret I didn't, like he was in on some cosmic joke that I was too wound up to understand. I pressed the emergency button again, harder this time, as if my frustration could somehow travel through the wiring and motivate whoever was supposed to be monitoring this thing. Nothing. They probably know we're stuck, the man said gently. The system would have alerted them when we stopped. And how do you know that? I don't, he admitted, but getting worked up about it won't make the elevator move any faster. I wanted to argue with him, but he had a point, and that made me more irritated. I was good at being irritated. It was a familiar feeling, reliable in its predictability. This man's calm acceptance of our situation was throwing off my entire emotional ecosystem. I loosened my tie and sat down against one wall, resigning myself to missing my train. The man, who still hadn't introduced himself, settled against the opposite wall, setting his takeout carefully beside him like he was arranging a picnic. The elevator felt smaller now that we weren't both standing. I could hear his breathing, steady and unhurried, while mine was still elevated from the adrenaline spike of realizing we were trapped. I could smell his food and something else. Soap, maybe, or laundry detergent. Something clean and uncomplicated. He wasn't nervous. Or if he was better at hiding it than I was. Do you always smile through everything? I asked. Partly because the silence was starting to feel heavy, and partly because I genuinely wanted to know. In my experience, people who smiled that much were either selling something or hiding something. His smile faded slightly, not disappearing but softening into something more thoughtful. No, he said quietly, just when I don't want to cry. I wasn't expecting honesty. It caught me off guard, made me look at him more closely. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who'd done his share of both smiling and crying, and suddenly his calmness didn't seem like an act anymore. It seemed like a choice. I'm Eli, he said, like we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of trapped in a broken elevator. David. Nice to meet you, David. Do you work here? 22nd floor, financial consulting. The words felt automatic, like I was reading them off a business card. You? I don't work here. I was visiting a friend. She's an architect on 39. We had dinner plans, but she had to cancel at the last minute. Client emergency. He gestured to the takeout containers. So I got stuck with enough Chinese food for 3 people and nowhere to go. Hence the dumplings. Hence the dumplings. He opened one of the containers, and the smell of the garlic and soy sauce filled the small space between us. You sure you don't want some? I'm going to feel guilty eating in front of you. My stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying me. I hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 10 a.m., and even though sharing food with a stranger went against every instinct I'd developed living in the city, I was hungry enough to consider it. I don't know you, I said, which wasn't really a no, but wasn't really a yes either. That's fair, Eli said. For all you know, I could be a serial killer who uses dumplings to lure victims into a false sense of security. Are you? A serial killer? No. Someone who uses food to make friends? Possibly. Despite myself, I almost smiled, almost. I don't need friends. Everyone needs friends. I have friends. When's the last time you saw them? I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it. Sarah's birthday party last month, or was that 2 months ago? The work happy hour that I'd left after 20 minutes because Jim from accounting had been droning on about his divorce? That's what I thought, Eli said, but not unkindly. He held out a plastic fork. Come on, you look like you haven't eaten all day, and I have enough lo mein to feed a small army. Against my better judgment, I took the fork. The food was still warm, and it was better than anything I would have heated up from my freezer later. We ate in relative silence. The only sounds the soft scrape of plastic against cardboard, and the occasional mechanical groan from somewhere in the elevator shaft above us. It occurred to me that this was the longest I'd sat still without doing something productive in months. No laptop open, no emails to answer, no reports to review. Just sitting in a metal box with a stranger eating Chinese food and listening to the building breathe around us. What do you do? I asked, partly to fill the silence and partly because I was curious despite myself. Graphic design mostly, some photography. I work from home, which means I probably talk to fewer people in a week than you do in a day. That sounds nice. It has its perks, also its downsides. Too much silence can be just as isolating as too much noise. I thought about my apartment, the way the quiet felt oppressive sometimes when I came home from the office, the way I'd started leaving the television on just to have voices in the background, even though I wasn't watching. Is that why you were having dinner with your friend, to get out of the house? Eli nodded. Clara and I try to meet up once a week. She keeps me from becoming a complete hermit, and I remind her that there's life outside her drafting table. The way he said it made it sound easy, natural, like maintaining friendships was just something people did, like watering plants or paying bills. I tried to remember the last time someone had checked in on me just to see how I was doing, not because they needed something from me at work or wanted to complain about their own problems. I couldn't. Must be nice, I said. And Eli gave me a look that was too perceptive for comfort. You could try it sometime. Making plans with people, leaving the office before dark. I leave before dark. When? Today. Because you had a choice? I didn't answer, because we both knew I didn't. I left when the work was done, and the work was never really done. It was just abandoned at whatever point exhaustion finally outweighed guilt. My phone buzzed against my leg, and for a moment I thought we'd gotten signal back. But it was just the battery warning. 15% left. We should probably save our phone batteries, I said, in case we need to call for help when the emergency system starts working again, in case of emergency. David. Eli's voice was patient, like he was talking to someone who was being deliberately obtuse. This is the emergency. He had a point, but admitting that meant accepting that we might be here longer than I wanted to think about. I turned off my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The elevator's emergency lighting cast everything in a yellow-tinged glow that made the space feel smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because the shadows seemed to press in at the edges, larger because the diffused light softened the hard lines of the walls and made it feel less like a cage. Eli pulled his own phone out, turned on the flashlight, and set it on the floor between us. The beam bounced off the metallic walls and created a small pool of brighter light, pushing back the yellow shadows. Better, he said. It was better. Not just because we could see each other more clearly, but because it felt intentional now, like we were choosing to be here, instead of just enduring it. Can I ask you something? Eli said. You're going to anyway. When's the last time you did something spontaneous? Spontaneous? Something unplanned. Something just because you wanted to, not because you had to. I thought about it longer than I should have needed to. I don't know. That's what I figured. Eli leaned back against the wall, crossing his legs in front of him. You have that look. What look? Like you're always thinking 3 steps ahead. Like you're trying to solve problems that haven't happened yet. He wasn't wrong, but I didn't like how easily he'd read me. I'd worked hard to cultivate a professional exterior, to project competence and control. The fact that this stranger could see through it in less than an hour was unsettling. Planning ahead isn't a character flaw, I said. I didn't say it was, but it can be exhausting. I didn't want to admit it, but talking to him made the space feel bigger somehow. Not physically, we were still trapped in a metal box, but metaphorically, like the walls had expanded just enough to let in a little more air, a little more possibility. What about you? I asked. When's the last time you did something spontaneous? About an hour ago when I decided to take the elevator instead of the stairs. That's spontaneous? For me, yeah. I usually take the stairs, better exercise, and elevators make me claustrophobic. I stared at him. You're claustrophobic and you're this calm about being trapped? Who says I'm calm? You're sitting there like we're having coffee on a park bench. Just because I'm not pacing around pressing buttons doesn't mean I'm not scared, Eli said. I'm terrified, but panicking won't help either of us, and you're already doing enough worrying for both of us. There was something about the way he said it, matter of fact, without judgment, that made me realize I'd been doing most of the emotional heavy lifting since we'd gotten stuck. I was the one who'd tried the emergency button 17 times. I was the one who'd checked my phone for signal every 30 seconds for the first 10 minutes. I was the one who'd been mentally calculating how long we could survive without water, as if we were trapped in a mine shaft instead of a building with a maintenance crew. Sorry, I said. For what? For, I don't know, being high-strung. You're not high-strung, you're just used to being in control. Same thing. No, it's not. High-strung is a personality trait. Being used to control is a coping mechanism. I looked at him more closely. Are you a therapist? No, but I've been to enough of them to recognize the signs. There was a story there, but I didn't ask. We'd shared enough honesty for one elevator ride, and I wasn't sure I was ready for more. Some conversations were better left for people who knew each other's last names and had more than one evening to unpack the implications. The silence that fell between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are thinking their own thoughts in the same space, aware of each other but not obligated to perform for each other's benefit. I found myself studying Eli's face in the phone light. He had strong features, defined jawline, straight nose, dark eyes that seemed to notice everything without staring. His hair was longer than mine, casual in a way that suggested he either paid a lot of money to look effortlessly rumpled, or he actually was effortless about it. Given everything else about him, I was betting on the latter. He caught me looking and raised an eyebrow. Sorry, and I said again, stop apologizing. We're stuck in here together. Looking at each other is pretty much all we've got to do. I could review quarterly reports on my phone. You could, or you could tell me something about yourself that isn't work-related. There isn't much. Everyone has something. Hobbies, interests, secret talents. I don't have secret talents. What do you do when you're not at the office? I thought about my evenings. Takeout containers on my kitchen counter, Netflix queued up to whatever I'd fallen asleep to the night before. The stack of books on my nightstand that I kept meaning to read but never had the energy for after a 12-hour day. I watched documentaries, I said finally. What kind? History, mostly, some science. Favorite era? World War II. The logistics of it, I mean. The planning, the coordination, how they managed to move that many people and resources across continents. Eli nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. What makes sense? That you'd be interested in large-scale organization. It's like financial consulting, but with higher stakes. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he was right. There was something appealing about the idea of imposing order on chaos, even if the chaos was historical and the order was retrospective. What about you? Emoshi, I asked. What do you do when you're not designing things? I cook, read, take pictures of interesting shadows. Interesting shadows? Light and shadow are what make photography work. Most people photograph the subject, but I'm usually more interested in how the light falls around it. That sounds pretentious? Eli laughed, a genuine sound that echoed off the metal walls and made the space feel less confined. It is pretentious, but it's also true. I found myself almost smiling again. There was something disarming about the way he owned his pretensions instead of denying them. Most people I knew spent so much energy trying to appear effortless that they forgot to be authentic. Static crackled through the emergency speaker, and we both looked up expectantly. It's to passengers in elevator car 7, a voice said, distorted by the poor connection. We're aware of the situation and working to resolve it. Please remain calm. We estimate it will take approximately 1 hour to get the car moving again. 1 hour. I felt my shoulders tense automatically. 1 hour meant I'd definitely missed the last good train. 1 hour meant I'd either have to take a much later train or spring for a cab, both of which would throw off my morning routine. 1 hour meant, guess you're stuck with me, Eli said, looking over at me with that same small smile from earlier. I wanted to be annoyed. I wanted to catalog all the ways this was going to disrupt my evening, my schedule, my carefully maintained sense of control over my small, predictable life. Instead, I looked at this man who'd shared his food with me and hadn't once checked the time on his phone, who'd called me out on my anxiety without making me feel worse about it, who seemed genuinely unbothered by the fact that we were trapped together, with nothing to do but exist in the same space. Could be worse, I said finally. Eli's smile widened just a fraction. Yeah? Yeah. You could have gotten stuck with someone who doesn't share their dumplings. The elevator settled around us with a soft, mechanical sigh, as if it, too, were accepting the reality of our situation. Outside, 37 floors below, the city was moving forward without us. People catching trains, ordering dinner, making plans for tomorrow. But here, in this small metal space between floors, time felt suspended. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was just here. Part 2. The hours stretched ahead of us like an uncharted territory. I'd spent so many years dividing time into neat, productive segments, meetings, deadlines, commute windows, that the concept of unstructured time felt almost foreign. Here, suspended between floors, the usual markers of progress didn't apply. There were no emails to answer, no reports to review, no carefully calibrated steps to take me from point A to point B. There was just Eli, sitting across from me in the soft glow of his phone's flashlight, looking like he'd found exactly where he was supposed to be. Want to play a game? He asked, settling back against the wall. A game? 2 truths and a lie. You tell me 3 things about yourself, 2 real, 1 made up, and I try to guess which one's the lie. I couldn't remember the last time someone had suggested we play a game. Isn't that something teenagers do at sleepovers? Probably, but we're not teenagers at a sleepover. We're 2 adults trapped in a metal box with nothing but time. He tilted his head. Unless you'd rather sit in silence for the next hour. The silence hadn't been uncomfortable, but there was something appealing about the structure of a game. Rules, objectives, a clear way to measure success or failure. Fine, I said, but you go first. Eli's eyes lit up like I just agreed to something far more interesting than a simple word game. Okay, let me think. He was quiet for a moment, fingers tapping against his knee. Got it. 1. I once got food poisoning from a gas station hot dog in rural Nebraska and spent 3 days in a motel room that only had one working channel, a 24-hour weather station. 2. I'm afraid of butterflies. 3. I can solve a Rubik's Cube in under 2 minutes. I studied his face, looking for tells. The gas station hot dog story was specific enough to be true, but also absurd enough to be fabricated. The butterfly phobia seemed too random to make up. The Rubik's Cube felt like the kind of skill someone might claim to have without actually possessing. The butterfly thing is the lie, I said. Wrong. I'm genuinely terrified of butterflies. Something about the way they flutter around so unpredictably. Give me a spider or a snake any day. So the Rubik's Cube? Also true, I learned in college when I was procrastinating on my thesis. Turns out I'm very good at procrastinating. The gas station hot dog? Complete fiction. I've never been to Nebraska, and I have a strict policy against eating anything that's been rotating under a heat lamp for an unknown amount of time. I shook my head. You're good at this. Years of practice, your turn. I tried to think of 3 things that would be difficult to parse. The problem was, my life didn't contain much mystery. Most of my stories were work-related or so mundane they'd put him to sleep. 1. I haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. 2. I can play piano. 3. I've never been in love. The words came out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted the third one. It was too revealing, too honest for a game that was supposed to be light entertainment. But Eli didn't react like I'd overshared. He just considered each statement with the same focused attention he'd given to everything else. The piano thing is the lie, he said finally. Wrong. Really? You play piano? Learned when I was a kid. My mother insisted on lessons. I wasn't particularly good, but I kept it up through high school. Do you still play? I don't have a piano. But if you did? I thought about it. Maybe, probably not. I don't have time for hobbies. Eli nodded like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. So the vacation thing is true, unfortunately, which means the love thing is the lie. There was a pause that felt heavier than it should have. I could have lied, I could have said yes. That was the fabrication that, of course, I'd been in love before. Instead, I found myself being honest again. No, that's true too. All 3 were true. I'm not very good at this game. Eli leaned forward slightly. That's not how it works. You're supposed to include a lie. I know how it works. I couldn't think of anything interesting enough to lie about. David. His voice was gentle. You haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. You play piano but don't own a piano, and you've never been in love. Any one of those things is interesting enough to build a whole conversation around. They're just facts. Facts about a person are never just facts. They're choices, circumstances, stories that haven't been finished yet. I didn't know how to respond to that. In my world, facts were data points to be analyzed and acted upon. The idea that they were stories felt too abstract, too open to interpretation. Tell me about the piano, Eli said. There's nothing to tell. I took lessons, I learned some basic pieces, Chopin, Bach, some contemporary stuff. When I went to college, I stopped playing. When I started working, I didn't have space for a piano in my apartment. Did you like it? Like what? Playing piano. I had to think about that. Most of my childhood memories were tied up with obligation, things I had to do, achievements I had to unlock, boxes I had to check to satisfy my parents' expectations. Piano lessons were just another item on the list. But there had been moments, late afternoons when the house was quiet, and I could work through a piece without anyone listening, without the pressure of recitals or progress evaluations. Just my fingers finding the keys, muscle memory, translating emotion into sound. Yes, I said quietly. I liked it. Then why don't you have a piano now? Because I live in a 400 square foot apartment in Brooklyn, and piano lessons don't translate into practical life skills. Says who? And says basic economics. Says prioritizing necessities over luxuries. Says being a functional adult. Eli was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if I'd been too harsh. I wasn't trying to be defensive, but something about his questions made me feel like I needed to justify choices I'd never questioned before. Can I tell you something? He said finally. Sure. People are different in elevators. What do you mean? Think about it. Elevators are these weird liminal spaces where strangers are forced into proximity for a few minutes, but everyone pretends not to exist, like it's easier that way. Eyes on the floor, phones out, total silence, even when you're pressed up against each other. I thought about every elevator ride I'd taken, all the careful choreography of avoiding eye contact and minimizing interaction. And you don't? Eli smiled again, that same soft expression that had been confusing me all evening. I try not to waste moments I didn't expect. Like getting stuck? Like meeting someone interesting when I wasn't planning to meet anyone at all. There was something in his voice that made me look at him more directly. The flashlight between us created a small circle of intimacy, and outside that circle, the world felt very far away. I realized I hadn't thought about work or my apartment or my disrupted evening routine in the last 20 minutes. I'd been completely present in this conversation, in this space, in whatever was happening between us. Your turn, I said, because I needed to redirect the energy before it became too intense. My turn for what? Two truths and a lie. I told you three truths by accident. You owe me a real round. Eli considered this. Okay, one, I once spent a summer working at a lighthouse in Maine. Two, I'm lactose intolerant, but I eat ice cream anyway, because life's too short. Three, I've been in love twice, and both times it ended badly. These felt more carefully constructed than his first round, but also more personal. I found myself wanting to know which ones were true, not because of the game, but because I was genuinely curious about his life. The lighthouse is the lie, I said. Wrong again. Best summer of my life, actually. Just me, a bunch of books, and the most incredible sunsets you've ever seen. The ice cream thing? Also true, I have Lacted, but sometimes I forget to take it, and sometimes I just don't care. So the love thing is the lie. Eli's expression shifted slightly. No, that's true too. You're doing the same thing I did. No, I'm not. One of those was definitely a lie. I went back through the three statements, trying to figure out what I'd missed. The lighthouse in Maine? True. Lactose intolerant ice cream eater? True. In love twice, ended badly? True. I stared at him. Then what was the lie? I said I've been in love twice. I didn't say I'd only been in love twice. That's cheating. That's creative interpretation. How many times? Does it matter? For the game, yes. For anything else, I didn't answer because I wasn't sure what anything else might encompass. We were strangers who'd been stuck together for less than 2 hours. His romantic history wasn't my business, and my curiosity about it wasn't appropriate. But I was curious. 3 times, he said, like he'd read my thoughts. The third time didn't end badly. It just ended. What's the difference? Badly implies someone got hurt. Someone made mistakes, said things they couldn't take back, burned bridges. He shifted position, stretching his legs out in front of him. Sometimes things just run their course. People grow in different directions. It's sad, but it's not tragic. That sounds very mature. I've had practice. We settled into another comfortable silence. I found myself thinking about the relationships in my life that had ended. Not romantic ones, since those barely existed, but friendships, professional partnerships, family connections that had faded over time. Most of them had just petered out through neglect, through distance, through the simple entropy of not trying hard enough to maintain them. I couldn't think of a single relationship that had ended because we'd grown in different directions. Most of them had ended because I'd stopped growing at all. Can I ask you something? I said. Sure. Earlier, when you said you smile when you don't want to cry, what did you mean? Eli was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd pushed too far. The game had created a kind of artificial intimacy between us, but that didn't mean we were actually close enough for real vulnerability. Sometimes, he said slowly, when things get overwhelming, I have a choice. I can let it break me down, or I can find something to be grateful for. The smiling isn't about pretending everything's fine. It's about acknowledging that even when things are hard, they're still happening. I'm still here to experience them. That's very philosophical. That's therapy speak, actually. I told you I'd been to enough therapists to recognize the signs. What signs? People who are used to being in control. People who plan 3 steps ahead. People who don't take vacations or play piano anymore, even though they want to. He looked at me directly. People who've convinced themselves that wanting things is dangerous. I felt exposed, like he'd identified something I'd been trying to hide even from myself. I don't think wanting things is dangerous. No? When's the last time you wanted something just because you wanted it, not because it made practical sense? I tried to think of an example and came up empty. Everything in my life was justified by logic, by necessity, by the rational progression from goal to action to result. Even my entertainment choices were educational. Documentaries instead of movies, news podcasts instead of music, books that taught me skills instead of stories that made me feel things. I don't know, I admitted. That's what I thought. You think that's unhealthy? I think it's exhausting. He wasn't wrong. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the constant mental effort of optimization, efficiency, control. I'd been tired for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to not be tired. What about you? I asked. What do you want that doesn't make practical sense? Eli smiled. Right now, I want this elevator to stay broken for a while longer. The honesty of it caught me off guard. Why? Because this is the most interesting conversation I've had in months. Because you're not checking your phone every 30 seconds or making small talk about the weather because he paused, like he was deciding whether to continue. Because I like who you are when you're not trying to be efficient. What do you mean? When you told me about playing piano, your whole face changed. When you're thinking about something real instead of just processing information, you look different, more present. I didn't know what to do with that observation. No one had ever told me I looked different when I was present, mostly because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had paid close enough attention to notice. I don't know how to be present, I said, which was more honest than I'd intended to be. You're being present right now. This is different. This is suspended, outside normal life. What if it didn't have to be? What do you mean? What if you could take some of this with you when the doors open? I thought about my apartment, my routine, my carefully structured life. The idea of introducing this kind of unplanned intimacy into my daily existence felt both appealing and terrifying. I don't know how, I said. Start small. Take a walk without a destination. Buy something impractical. Call someone just to talk, not because you need something. I don't really have anyone to call. The words slipped out before I could censor them, and immediately I felt the familiar shame that came with admitting loneliness. I had colleagues, acquaintances, distant family members I exchanged holiday cards with, but no one I could call just to talk. No one who would be happy to hear from me without a specific reason. Eli didn't react with pity or surprise. He just nodded like this was useful information rather than a character flaw. What about Clara? I asked, partly to deflect attention from my own admission. Your friend who works here. How long have you known her? Since college. We were in the same art history class freshman year, bonded over our mutual hatred of pretentious critique sessions. And you've stayed in touch this whole time? More or less. There were a few years after graduation when we lost track of each other. You know how it is. Everyone scattering to different cities, different lives. But we reconnected about 5 years ago when we both ended up in New York. How? Random encounter at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. She was there with her laptop, working on some architectural drawings, and I was there taking pictures of the way the afternoon light hit the brick walls. We recognized each other, started talking, realized we'd both been in the city for 2 years without knowing it. That's lucky. Or inevitable. New York's big, but creative communities are small. We were bound to cross paths eventually. I tried to imagine having that kind of continuity with another person, someone who knew me well enough to seek me out, to be genuinely happy to see me after years apart. The closest I came to that was my relationship with my work, which was consistent but not exactly nourishing. Do you ever miss it? Eli asked. Having people who knew you before you became who you are now? I am who I've always been. Are you? I wanted to say yes, that I was essentially the same person I'd been in college and high school and childhood, just with more professional polish and life experience. But as I thought about it, I realized that wasn't true. Somewhere along the way, I'd edited out the parts of myself that didn't serve my career goals. The piano playing, the spontaneous decisions, the willingness to be curious about other people. I guess I've become more focused, I said finally. Focused on what? Success, stability, building a life that makes sense. And does it make sense? I looked around the elevator, at the emergency lighting, at the takeout containers scattered between us, at Eli's face and the glow of his phone. 2 hours ago, my life had made perfect sense. Everything in its place, every choice justified by logic and necessity. Now I wasn't sure. Most of the time, I said, but not all the time. Sometimes I get home from work and sit in my apartment and wonder what I'm doing it all for. Like I'm building towards something, but I'm not sure what the something is. It was the most honest I'd been about my own dissatisfaction, even to myself. I expected Eli to offer advice or reassurance, to try to solve the problem I just articulated. Instead, he just nodded. That sounds lonely, he said quietly. It is lonely. We sat with that admission for a moment. I'd never said it out loud before, never allowed myself to name the feeling that crept in during those quiet Sunday afternoons when I'd finished all my weekend chores and had nothing left to do but think about how empty the week ahead felt. Is that why you don't take vacations? Eli asked. Because of being alone with yourself feels worse than being busy? Maybe, and I don't know. I've never really thought about it. What would you do with a week off? I honestly don't know. Sleep in, I guess. Read those books I keep meaning to get to. Maybe find somewhere to play piano. That sounds nice. It sounds boring. Or peaceful. I considered that. Maybe the problem wasn't that I didn't know how to relax. Maybe the problem was that I'd forgotten how to distinguish between boredom and peace. Without really thinking about it, I shifted position, stretching my legs out until my knees were almost touching Eli's. He didn't move away, and neither did I. It was such a small point of contact, barely noticeable, but it changed something about the space between us. Made it feel less like two separate people sharing an elevator, and more like two people choosing to be close to each other. Can I tell you something? I said. Of course. This is the longest I've gone without checking the time in months. How long do you think we've been here? I tried to estimate, but realized I had no idea. The conversation had created its own time zone, separate from the regular progression of minutes and hours. I don't know. Does it matter? It should. I have things to do tomorrow. A routine to maintain. Will the world end if you're tired tomorrow? No. Will you get fired if you're 10 minutes late? No. Then maybe it doesn't matter as much as you think it does. I wanted to argue with him, to explain about the importance of consistency and reliability, but I couldn't summon the energy for the defense. Maybe he was right. Maybe some things mattered less than I'd convinced myself they did. Static crackled through the emergency speaker again. Attention passengers in elevator car 7. We've identified the issue and expect to have you moving again within the next 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience. The announcement felt like a bucket of cold water. In 15 minutes, this would be over. The doors would open, we'd step back into our respective lives, and this strange, suspended intimacy would become just another story about the time I got stuck in an elevator. Well, Eli said, that's that. Yeah. Neither of us moved. We sat there with our knees almost touching, looking at each other in the dim light. And I felt something that might have been sadness at the prospect of this ending. You think we'll ever talk again once the doors open? I asked. The question came out more vulnerable than I'd intended, but I needed to know. This conversation had felt different from any interaction I'd had in years, and I wasn't ready to let it go. Eli looked at me for a long moment. Do you want to? I think I do. Think? No, I know I do. His smile was softer this time, less mysterious and more genuinely warm. Then yes, I think we probably will. The elevator gave a small shudder, and somewhere above us, machinery began to hum. We were moving again, slowly but unmistakably, upward. I felt panic rise in my chest, not about the elevator, but about the conversation ending, about stepping back into my regular life and losing whatever this was that we'd created between us. Eli, I said. Yeah? I don't want this to be one of those things that just ends because it runs its course. It doesn't have to be. The elevator dinged softly as we reached the 36th floor, then the 35th. Soon we'd be back at ground level, back to being strangers who happened to share an unusual experience. I'm not good at this, I said, at keeping in touch with people, at making plans that aren't work-related, at being the kind of person someone wants to have dinner with. Maybe you could learn. Maybe. The elevator dinged again. 34th floor. Time was running out. I live in Brooklyn, I said, like this was important information he needed to have. I live in Queens. We could, if you wanted to, we could get dinner sometime. Actual dinner, not takeout in a broken elevator. I'd like that. The elevator settled to a stop, and I heard the mechanical sounds of doors preparing to open. After 2 hours of artificial twilight, the hallway lights were going to seem impossibly bright. David, Eli said. Yeah? Whatever happens when those doors open, this was real. This conversation, this connection, it happened. You don't have to be afraid that it was just the circumstances. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The doors began to slide open, and fluorescent hallway light flooded into our small space, harsh and immediate after the soft glow of the phone flashlight. Eli stood up, shouldering his messenger bag and gathering the empty takeout containers. For a moment, silhouetted against the bright hallway, he looked like a stranger again. Someone I might pass on the street without recognizing. Then he looked back at me, still sitting on the elevator floor, and smiled. I'm around, he said, if you ever want more dumplings. I stood up quickly, brushing off my pants, trying to transition back into the version of myself that existed outside this elevator. But before I could lose my nerve, I reached into my pocket for my phone. Give me your number. Number, I said. Eli's smile widened, and he rattled off 10 digits while I typed them into my contacts. When I looked up, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Call me, he said simply. I will. Promise? Promise. He stepped out of the elevator, turned back once to wave, and then disappeared around the corner toward the building's exit. I stood there for a moment, alone in the elevator with the doors still open, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text message. From Eli's number, thanks for sharing your hour with me. I typed back, thanks for making it feel like a gift instead of an inconvenience. The response came immediately. See you soon, David. I stepped out of the elevator and into the bright hallway, but I could still feel the warmth of that small space, still hear the echo of genuine conversation, still remember what it felt like to be seen by someone who wasn't trying to get anything from me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was looking forward to making a phone call.